Hey creatives, I'm your host Aylin Wild and this is my podcast Empathy Machine. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today on the podcast I'll be discussing the recently released film Dark Waters, directed by Todd Haynes, whose other works include Carol and Far From Heaven, written by Mario Correa and Matthew Michael Carnahan, and starring and produced by Mark Ruffalo along with others. Now, this is my first film review / film discussion. I don't really want to call them film reviews because I just feel like I'm not really qualified to review films. And also, I'm just not really into saying whether they're good or bad. I just kind of want to discuss them. Just a heads up though, if you haven't seen this film, there will be spoilers. I don't know if you can spoil anything that's real, seeing as this is a true story. I don't know if you can have spoilers, but just in case, if you didn't know what happened and you wanted to go see it, maybe wait to listen to this until after you've seen it. So I'm just going to be discussing the film and my response to it. I had a really interesting conversation with my dad actually after seeing this film. I just thought it would be a great one to start out with. So the film is based on a New York Times article written in 2016 by Nathaniel Rick called The Lawyer Who Became DuPont's Worst Nightmare. And you can actually still find this article on the New York Times website. I have read it. It's really interesting. I would definitely recommend, if you like this film, I would definitely recommend you go check out the article because it's really interesting. It gives you a lot more in-depth information. It's really good. It's like a story. It's so interesting and it's so eye-opening. So I'm just going to quickly go over the basic story of the film. So the central character is a real-life lawyer called Robert Billett, who is played by Mark Ruffalo. He's a corporate defense lawyer from Ohio who primarily defends chemical companies. He is approached by a farmer called Wilbur Tennant, who was a friend of his grandmother's, to sue a chemical company called DuPont, which he believes is killing his cows. So even though this case isn't the kind of case he would normally take, he goes to see this farmer as kind of like a favor to his grandmother, and he discovers some really confusing and bewildering things. First of all, you're met with the information that 190 of this guy's cows have died from completely unexplained illnesses, from tumors, organ failures, strange diseases, malformed hooves, lesions, receding eyes, rotting teeth. And they were also becoming deranged. So there is this scene where this cow basically starts charging them and the farmer is forced to shoot it because it's clearly just not right in the head. And in the New York Times article, he actually talks about how these cows used to love them. They used to run up to them and let them pat them. They were really friendly. And then all of a sudden one day they just completely changed. They became completely different animals and they didn't recognize them anymore. They would start charging at them. He also takes him down to the creek, the stream, and he sort of sees these like frothy mounds in the stream, which is turning the rocks white. And he sort of explains that, he's gone to the lawyers in the town, he's gone to the vets in the town, and no one is willing to speak to him. No one is willing to help him because they are all somehow associated with DuPont, which is the chemical company that a lot of the town gets their employment from. And it's all a very muted color scheme. It almost looks like a zombie apocalypse movie. The farm looks horrible and dead. The town's full of sick people. There's this part where he rides past this girl and she smiles at him and she has black teeth. So he's understandably quite shaken up by all of this. He's quite confused. He knows that something is going on. It's definitely not right. So he decides to file a small federal suit against the chemical company DuPont, thinking that they would, do the right thing and rectify the situation. DuPont then sends out some vets to check the property, and they claim that the farmer Tennant doesn't know how to look after his cows, that they have poor nutrition, inadequate veterinary care, and a lack of fly control. The Tennants experience hate by their community for going up against DuPont. They go into a restaurant and people leave or they don't want to talk to them. Billett then discovers through some documents sent over by DuPont that they're using an unregulated chemical called PFOA or C8, which the film explains was used for army tanks, but was then developed by DuPont for the production of Teflon or non-stick pans. He then requests a court order for DuPont to hand over all of their documentation, which ends up being over 110,000 pages, thinking that, he'd have so much documentation to go over that he wouldn't find anything because it'd just be so buried. He'd have too much to go through. He wouldn't do it. But he does go through it. He spends a long time going through all this documentation. He sorts it all, puts it in date order, and he discovers some very incriminating evidence against DuPont. He discovers that they actually have done tests starting in about the 60s, which reveal cancerous links in animals, birth defects in children of pregnant mothers exposed, and possible DNA damage. He then slowly uncovers many links to other diseases by ex-employees who would regularly get the Teflon flu from working in the factory, and it's also revealed that both the farmer and his wife have cancer. And the article explains that DuPont dumped 7,100 tons of PFOA into the dry run landfill, which ran onto tenants' property. And hundreds of thousands of pounds were pumped into the Ohio River, which entered the water supply of more than 100,000 people. And some of these people had been drinking this water for decades. It also says that, in general, not specifically related to DuPont, but the safe level of PFOA in the water supply of people in America was exceeded in some cases by factors of 100 or more in 94 water systems across 27 states. So Billett ends up filing one big class action suit against DuPont for everyone whose water was tainted, much to the detriment of the law firm and his own career, but he needs evidence to prove the chemical causes health problems, which then results in, I think it's the biggest national health survey ever conducted, with 70,000 people giving their blood to be tested, which obviously takes a long time. It ends up taking them 7 years to test all of these blood samples. Apparently they developed 12 different tests. And during this time, obviously, he's experiencing intense financial strain. The locals are angry. Many of them are dying or, getting cancer. They just want answers. They want justice. The farmer also dies, and his wife 2 years later dies as well. Finally, Billett is contacted by scientists who have been testing the blood samples and is told that it has been linked to various deadly diseases: kidney cancer, testicular cancer, thyroid cancer, high cholesterol, preeclampsia, and ulcerative colitis. And you kind of reach this moment where you're like, oh my goodness, that's amazing. He's got justice for all these people. But he experiences even more pushback from DuPont, who basically want to take on each case individually, and there's over 3,000 cases. But eventually they do settle and he wins the case. And there's these credits at the end which explain that C8 or PFOA is in 99% of humans, because it can't be broken down, which the article explains is because it binds to plasma proteins in the blood and it circulates through each organ in the body. It can be passed on through the air, through diet, through nonstick cookware, or just through your umbilical cord. And then it says that there are 60,000 other chemicals that are still unregulated by the EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency. And the article explains that this is because the EPA is only allowed to regulate chemicals when they have been provided evidence of harm. So the chemical companies must approach them, which obviously results in only 5 chemicals being restricted in the last 40 years. The article also mentions that Parkersburg, which is the town the tenants lived in, still has high levels of PFOA in drinking water, and that most of the residents are unaware of this. In 2003, an EPA study found the average concentration of PFOA in the blood of an adult American was 4 to 5 parts per billion. And the safe level, according to toxicologists, is 0.2 parts per billion. Now, I had a look on DuPont's website. It's very clean, well designed. There's lots of pictures of smiling employees. They have a values page, which states that their values are safety and health, respect for people, highest ethical behavior, and protecting the planet. And according to the article, DuPont did cease production of PFOA in 2013, with 5 other companies around the world phasing out production. However, they have replaced it with similar fluorine-based compounds designed to biodegrade more quickly, which are, funnily enough, also unregulated by EPA, which resulted in the Madrid Statement, which was signed by 200 scientists, which basically says that all fluorochemicals, even in extremely low doses, are dangerous to human health. And Billett sort of says in the article that the EPA has done very little to rectify this situation. So, coming out of the film, it was very difficult to watch. Honestly, it was so shocking. It was almost unbelievable. I came out feeling really hopeless. I felt like there was nothing that could be done about this. It was just too big of a problem for anyone to tackle. And generally, I'm not a big fan of films that depict such extreme views of good and evil, But in this case, I think it's pretty fairly warranted, considering how all of us have been directly affected by this. So despite the good versus evil flaw, I thought it was very engaging. It keeps you interested even when you don't quite understand what's going on. And it definitely succeeds in its goal to provide valuable information, to open our eyes to something we may not have fully understood or even knew anything about. I didn't know anything about this. And I think one of the biggest testaments to this is that the audience that I was watching it with, when I left the cinema, everyone was silent. It was like eerily quiet. And usually people, when they leave a cinema, they're chatting, they're talking about the film, but no one was talking leaving the cinema, and you could tell everyone was kind of just in shock. And this definitely resonated with me. One of my goals this year, I have a vision board for the year, and one of my goals, because I've been feeling quite convicted about it lately, is to live more sustainably, to waste less. I watched this show on Netflix, which I would highly recommend. It's called Broken, and it's sort of about the consumerist society and how it's harming all of us and the planet. It mentions in the plastics episode that one garbage truck of plastic is dumped into the ocean every minute. And it kind of highlights the global crisis that we're experiencing at the moment with mass production and mass waste. And this film, I think, is just kind of a symbol of all of that. Because C8 is really a convenience chemical. It causes so much harm, but people are still using it. I mean, people know about this, and it was on the news in a lot of countries, and people still use Teflon. I used it when I got home from watching that movie. And just fluoropolymers in general. The fluoropolymer industry is used for so many things: kitchen products, computer cables, implantable medical devices, bearings and seals in cars and airplanes. It's really hard to completely get rid of these harmful chemicals when we use them in everyday life all the time. And I've definitely experienced, even just in trying to buy more sustainable products myself, I've been trying to buy makeup from the Body Shop, and my bank balance has not thanked me for that at all. It's so much cheaper to buy from the drugstore. And honestly, I just don't think at the moment I can sustain that. I had to go back to buying from the drugstore because it was just so expensive. So what is the answer to all of this? I think the important thing is that we first ask the question, that we don't ignore these issues because they seem impossible or uncomfortable to think about. And I think there's two ways to view this film. One is that we're all doomed. And there's nothing that can be done. We can't do anything about this. It's too big. It's too much. Or, as the real Robert Billet puts it, an individual can make a huge change. They can take on one of the biggest companies in the world and make that change. Nothing is too big to take on. And then he says in the article, there was a reason why I was interested in helping out the tenants. It was a great opportunity to use my background for people who really needed it. And I think that's really inspirational for me, definitely, is that just because your life isn't going in the direction you want it to or you planned it to, it doesn't mean you can't use things from your past to make a difference and to help people. And that's exactly what he did. He used his experiences with defending chemical companies to help not only the tenants, but all of us, really. And I think we can all use experiences that we've had in life, even if they haven't been positive, to make a positive difference. And I think sometimes God uses those moments and those periods of our lives where we're not necessarily proud and we don't necessarily think we're doing anything of any use or help to anyone else. And he uses it to bless someone else later or helps us to understand something that we wouldn't necessarily understand otherwise. So I think I've chosen to be inspired by Billet instead of being disheartened by DuPont or by humanity's love of convenience. He studied environmental law because it was something you could do to make a difference. In his view, he was helping the chemical companies to do the right thing. He was proud of his work, but he had a decision to make. And I think that's a question that's posed by the film is, when you come face to face with this decision, what will you do? Will you choose an easy path of comfort? He would have been way more successful, less stressed, more wealthy had he chosen to ignore this case and go on with his career and defend these wealthy companies. Or will you choose the hard path of resistance? He developed a medical condition from stress. He was hated by this community and by the the chemical companies. He lost a lot of money for his family as well as for his firm. He risked everything doing the right thing. And if not for him, we wouldn't even know about PFOA. Like, just think about how his actions affected the world, affected all of us. And most of us don't even know who he is. And I think, just because we're not there yet, it doesn't mean that we won't ever become a sustainable global society. I think if there are enough people like Billet, we can do it. So I think the lesson to be learned by this film is to choose the right path, even if it's the path of most resistance, and you can change the world. And this is exactly why I love film. I love that it inspires people. I love that it informs people of what's going on. And this film definitely made me think. It made me think for days after watching it. And that's definitely my favorite kind of film. Even if it's not comfortable to watch, even if you don't want to think about it, I think it's great that we're forced to think about these things. And yes, it did take a bit of creative license with making the chemical company the big bad guy, which, like I said, I don't normally appreciate. But the important thing is that it got its message across and definitely got me thinking. So yeah, that was my thoughts on Dark Waters. Let me know what you think. Thank you so much for listening. If this episode inspired you at all, please don't forget to leave me a review. That would be really helpful. I hope you have a great week and tune in next time for more creative insight into my experiences in the world of video and film.